So we're going to start now. I think we're getting people joining still, but they will come in as we move into the webinar. I would like first to introduce myself. My name is Rami Zuraik. I will give a slightly longer introduction a bit later, but I am going to be the moderator of this session of the webinar. I am a professor in the Landscape Design and Ecosystem Management Department, and also the director of the Food Security Program. Today's webinar is titled A Water Energy Food Nexus Approach for Evaluating the Sustainability of the Mediterranean Diets and Taking the Special Case of Lebanon. May I have the next slide, please? Hello, who's moving the slides?
I am. Can you see the next slide?
Yes, please. Thank you, Rania. So this, we already saw that slide. I think people can see me and they all now know who I am. And more important than me, next slide, please. I want to introduce, next please. I wish to introduce the theme behind this very important work. Dr. Sandra Yanni, who is a research scientist currently at the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and also on leave from her position as assistant professor at the American University of Beirut. I also I'm happy to introduce Dr. Bassel Daher, an assistant research scientist at Texas A&M Energy Institute, and Dr. Rabi Mohtar, currently professor in the Department of Biological and Agricultural Engineering and Civil and Environmental Engineering at Texas A&M, currently also adjunct professor at the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences at the American University of Beirut, where he served as a dean for the past 5 years. Welcome to you all, researchers. We're very happy to have you here. Among also the researchers, Dr. Rula Bashour, who will not be with us today, but is with us in spirit and played a key role in this research, an agronomist and currently with IRIWatch in the Netherlands, and Dr. Sasha Ko-Shima, who is the Deputy Director of the Land and Water Division at FAO, who was also instrumental setting up this research and contribute to analyzing its findings. Let's move on. And let me give you a brief aperçu of what, Tranya, next slide, of what we will be doing today. I will speak very briefly, a couple of slides about the conception of the project, the FAO-AUB partnership, and the project objectives. So we anchor everything in a good understanding of what we are aiming to do. And then Dr. Yanni will give us the background, the motivation, the methodology, and the framework. Dr. Bassel Daher, the scenarios, the results, and the trade-offs. And Professor Rabia Mohtar will wrap up by telling us about the project outcomes and the policy implications of this work. Next slide, Rania. Next. Okay, so
time to move to the next slide.
Yeah, yes. I think we may have, maybe we want to ask Joan to have a go at that. If your bandwidth is better, Joan, would you like? I don't know if that is even possible. I'm not sure, but it looks like we're having bandwidth problem. This is what I was fearing here from Lebanon. Anyways, to talk about how this project was conceived, it started when Professor Mokhtar was Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture, and an MOU between the FAO and AUB, the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences, was signed in June 2019, a very momentous time in Lebanon back then. And this moved into a portfolio of collaboration between the FAO and the FAFSA at the American University of Beirut. And a one-year project scoped as developing a WEF Nexus framework for the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon was initiated in July 2019, and the data collection ended in August 2020. So next, please. And on the region is the main agricultural region of the country. It makes up about 1/3 of the country, but produces in excess of 65% of the agricultural output, and it is located inland. And then the project objectives were to identify and quantify. And that's important because we do a lot of descriptive work, but this is essentially quantitative work, the critical interconnections between water, energy, and food systems in Lebanon. And then also to bring these together by developing a Nexus framework that allows us to understand the system of, this whole WEF system as a system of systems, that interfaces between water, energy, and food, and assess thus the trade-offs associated with adopting one intervention or another's. And this is what is termed scenarios, and this is what Professor Daher is going to be presenting. And lastly, and not least, to evaluate the farmers' perception and their willingness to implement proposed intervention. I'll have you note that this project takes it all the way from the conceptual framework, the theory, the scenario development, all the way to the on-field, in farmers' field assessment of the interventions. I will give now the floor to Dr. Yanni. Dr. Yanni, are you with us?
I am, thank you. Thank you, everybody, and welcome. Let me know if you cannot hear me well, please. I will start things off with a background of the Lebanese conditions at the time and now, and the resources that are available in the country to work with. Some of the challenges facing Lebanon are natural, such as limitations of water and land, but also there are economic and other issues. And as you might know or have heard, Lebanon is facing an economic problem for the past several years, and a almost complete financial collapse since the late 2019. Historically also, there has been an influx of refugees, the most recent of which was during the war in Syria. The population in Lebanon has increased dramatically, putting high pressure on resources, especially water and energy. And additionally, there are climate change impacts, which are also affecting the freshwater availability. All of these are having an impact on food security in the country. And there is a need to reduce reliance on import. And this is basically due to the financial limitations that the country is going through. Like other countries in the region, agriculture is a heavy user of water, but it contributes only about 4% of the GDP. And therefore, to justify the use of water, water and energy allocated to agriculture needs to be used much more efficiently. So coming into this project, we were thinking that producing the high protein, nutritious foods that use lower amounts of water or that are basically rain-fed without irrigation would be the way to go to produce this efficiency. So we look to increase this type of production, and we asked the question if this would be feasible. What sort of trade-offs need to be made to achieve this? Can we allocate our resources, at least within agriculture, to be more efficient? And what would be the impact of these on these resources if we change the production system? Next, please. Thank you. So basically, there is a water gap and a high cost of energy, as well as limitations in the amount of land available for crop production. So the resources that we can rely on are as follows. First, the renewable water varies anywhere between 850 to 2,000 cubic meters per capita annually. And in some years, it can be less than that. Almost all precipitation occurs over 3 to 4 months in winter, which is outside the growing season, which is usually a hot growing season. 60% of all the water in the country goes to agriculture in order to irrigate 50 to 80% of the crops. And energy is mainly based on fossil fuels. 9% of this energy is used in agriculture for field operations and water pumping and things like that. Up until now, all the fuel is imported, which is paid for in the very expensive US dollars. Farmers receive electricity from the grid, from the public grid, but because there's heavy electricity cuts, they heavily rely on individual generators and on diesel for the farm machinery and for all operations. Alternative water resources and energy or untraditional resources are available, but they are largely unexploited. So our study takes this into consideration. Next, please. So the land resources generally are limited for agricultural production. Lebanon is a small country, and the cultivated land, as per the 2010 census, was estimated at 231,000 hectares. 42% of this is in the Beqa Valley, which is inland. It's not on the seashore, and it is a semi-arid region in Lebanon, which requires water irrigation for producing crops. Any increase in the amount of local production needs to take into account the acreage that is available. One of the challenges for developing agriculture is the small farm size. Around 70% of the farmers have farms that are less than 1 hectare. So we can see that we have the typical challenges of a small country in a semi-arid region.
A couple of years ago, so anyway, let's continue.
I remember that one. Okay. So next, please. As for the methodology, so we explored the availability and resource requirements that can allow the increase of production of basically legumes and pulses, which are plant-based proteins that can replace some meat production and meat consumption eventually. Meat is, first of all, expensive, and second, it is a heavy user of water. So replacing some of it with plant-based proteins is both healthy for the human beings, but also has a smaller environmental footprint. So we focused on a Lebanese-style Mediterranean diet and the crops that can be grown specifically in the Lebanese conditions and climate. We came up with 33 crops that are shown here in the table. And we classified them according to a self-sufficiency ratio, based on the 2017 numbers or conditions. So self-sufficiency is the factor that describes the amount of food that is locally produced divided by the total consumption, which is production plus import minus what is exported. So production plus import minus export. So those highlighted in red and in yellow, they have low and medium self-sufficiency, which means they are mostly imported at the time in 2017 and still are. But they also have low irrigation requirements, and most of them are high protein foods, plant-based foods. So we can be, it would be good to have these increase in production. So this scatter plot shows the irrigation water use for all the crops from the previous table and the protein values on the x-axis. And these crops that have low irrigation requirements, high in protein, and have a potential to increase their acreage. So this will be on the lower right-hand side of the crop, of the plot. Because they are already produced on a small percentage of land. And some of these are things like lentils and beans and almonds and walnuts, just as an example. Next. So this is a representation of the main framework, the conceptual framework that we developed. And it represents the interconnections between water, energy, and food, which was considered specifically for this study. In the center, in the box, we have the resources, which are the water, the food, and the energy, and the links between them was defined. Water resources available for irrigation include things like groundwater, surface water, and treated wastewater, which we considered here. Each of them incurs a different cost and a different environmental impact based on the energy use. Energy is also composed of a combination of gasoline, diesel, solar, and wind, although wind is not really produced or used in Lebanon. And there are greenhouse gas emissions from this energy use, which was computed. Food, also in there in the green, uses land and it has a cost for production, and it accounts for irrigation needs, which is evaporation minus rainfall, based on the crop type. The nutritional value of this food was quantified according to energy with a unit of kilocalorie per 100 grams. Guiding these, or guiding how these resources are used, there are scenarios of production, this is on the left-hand side, and sources of water and energy. Included in there is also a currency conversion, which accounts for the devaluation of the Lebanese pound compared to the US dollar. Just to give you an idea, in 2017, you could buy $1 for 1,500 Lebanese pounds, and today it is over 30,000 for $1 US. And at the time of the study, the conversion rate was 4,000, and this is one of the numbers you will see later with Dr. Daher. Decisions related to the type of crops grown will be the building foundation for quantifying the interconnections across the whole resource system being considered. The outputs will then define the resources needed for the selected scenarios. And I should just mention here that in this study, the cost was used rather than profit for each of the scenarios that were quantified. And then trade-offs have to be evaluated and decisions made based on stakeholder preferences and really sectoral policies and multi-stakeholder dialogue. Next. Now, we were always aware that for some of the allocation scenarios that we come up with to be possible and to be adopted, it was important to take into consideration the farmers' perceptions about how they use their resources and their willingness to change their current practices. So we, in this study, conducted a survey with 200 farmers who are working in the Bekaa Valley in an effort to learn about their willingness to shift to, for example, different crops or alternative water resources or alternative energy sources on their farm. We were also interested to learn if farmers' priorities to minimize water or energy or land or emissions from these different scenarios? Like, would they be willing to reduce their, for example, energy cost, and what's the priority there? And insights from this evaluation could be then used to predict the responsiveness to different scenarios and also to inform policy incentives down the line. And with that, I will hand over the virtual microphone to Dr. Daher to discuss the scenarios and the results.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sandra, for setting the stage, providing us with the background, and highlighting the framework that we use to develop the scenarios that I'll be sharing as part of my presentation today. So following the conceptual framework and the different portfolios that we wanted to consider for food, energy, and water, as we explored different possibilities and interventions across these different sectors, we took 2017 as our base case scenario. So we collected data for that year. How much were we producing of these food crops? What were the water sources we were using, and what percentages and ratios were of those water sources were used for irrigation, again in year 2017, as well as energy used for food production and energy used for water pumping and treatment as well. We used several databases, including FAO databases, Ministry of Agriculture, census reports, USDA food composition databases for the nutrition part of the analysis that we did, local weather data, local crop water requirements, and other, which were also part of the survey that Dr. Yani mentioned, where we collected some of that data firsthand as well as we did that analysis. So we basically followed the framework that we developed and quantified the water, energy, land cost, emissions, nutrition, as well as reliance for each for the base case scenario as a start. And based on that, we wanted to look at, as we explore new possibilities and new interventions that we want to take across the three sectors, decisions made for choosing whether we want to produce different food products at different self-sufficiencies, different water portfolios, different energy portfolios. What implications does that have, and what are the trade-offs that we need to be aware of as we shift to different practices? Next slide, please. So again, we explored three categories of scenarios. One that looked at increasing self-sufficiency versus importing of these food products from the diet that we identified. We looked at conventional water sources versus treated water for irrigation, and we looked at fossil-based energy versus renewable energy. And again, we looked at the trade-offs related to irrigated water needs, energy requirements, carbon emissions, land requirements, cost, as well as nutrition trade-offs associated with these different scenarios. So we developed an Excel-based tool, basically, that helped us play with these different scenarios and make different changes across the three sectors, three domains, and in order to quantify what trade-offs should we expect as we make those changes. Next slide. So I'll go quickly through some of the preliminary scenarios that we did under the three categories that I just mentioned. And with this scenario here, so we saw earlier in a graph by Dr. Yani the high nutritional content and the low irrigation needs of beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas. We also saw the low self-sufficiency of producing these food products in Lebanon. So given that low self-sufficiency of producing these food products, and given the despite their high nutritional content and low irrigation needs, this first scenario, we decided to explore increasing the self-sufficiency of these 4 specific food products to 100%. What would it take for us to produce all of our beans, chickpeas, and peas at 100% self-sufficiency? Energy and water sources and the ratios, as well as the currency conversions rate, were kept as 2017 values. So really, the only change we made was what if we kept everything the same as 2017 and produced all of our beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas. So according to our analysis, around 12% more water and energy, as well as 16% more land are required for achieving that full self-sufficiency of beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas. We notice here that this scenario exceeded the arable land limit that we have in the Bekaa Valley, and this additional land requirement could be achieved either by restoring degraded lands or unexploited lands for agriculture, which also does come at a cost that need to be further accounted for. Alternatively, improved management practices can also have a potential for increasing productivity of already utilized lands and contributing to bridging that land gap. As part of the scenario, we also see 1.2% cost savings that is attributed to the difference in cost of local production versus import. Given that the main source of energy in this base case scenario is diesel, the scenario here produces 12% more emissions. So as we're producing more and needing more energy for agricultural production, given that diesel is our main source of energy being used on farms, we have 12% more emissions. In addition, producing these crops also contributes to an increase of 6% in locally produced highly nutritious calories of the overall consumed basket. As we see, also this scenario results in reducing our reliance on imports by 2.8%. So the more we're producing locally, the less reliant we are on imports. So overall, by investing in growing our needs, meeting all of our needs of beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas locally, we see cost savings, increased nutritional value in the locally produced basket, and reduced reliance on food markets. In return, on the other side, this comes at an additional water, energy, land, and carbon footprint, which also needs to be accounted for and discussed with across different sectors. Moving to the second scenario, which looks at shifting from export to more local production. So a lot of the food products that we identified in the Mediterranean basket, we produce at a self-sufficiency that exceeds 100%. So we actually produce more than what we consume, and we export some of that additional produce. So this scenario explores the possibility of reducing local production of crops that are currently exceeding that full self-sufficiency ratio and are currently exported. So this includes potatoes, lettuce, apple, grapefruit, citruses, bananas, grapes, apricots, peach, almonds, and cherries. So similar to the first scenario, this scenario increases or considers increasing the self-sufficiency of beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas to 100%. So it's the same as the previous scenario, yet for those food products that we're producing above 100%, we're limiting it to 100%, and we're not exporting the excess. We're not necessarily saying that this is what we need to do, but we're exploring different scenarios here and looking at different trade-offs. As part of this scenario, also water and energy sources and the ratios with groundwater and surface water, as well as diesel and gasoline. For energy, the sources and ratios were the same as 2017, so we didn't change anything there. In this scenario, we notice a decrease in water and energy requirements, which were initially allocated to locally produced and exported crops in the base case scenario. One of the key challenges of fully growing beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas is the low yield compared to other crops. So despite reducing the self-sufficiency of many of the currently produced and exported crops, this scenario still requires an additional 9.1% increase in land requirement compared to the 2017 scenario. Here we can also talk about the need for innovation and breeding to produce higher yielding varieties, which would improve these estimates and reduce that high expected land requirement for such a scenario. The reduction in energy requirement resulting from producing less of the formerly exported crops results in the reduction in carbon footprint, which we also see here. Also, the increase in nutritional value is similar to scenario A, since we are still, the only thing we're doing in this scenario is we're just limiting whatever we're producing for export, so it doesn't have necessarily an impact, a different impact on the nutritional value of the nationally produced basket for local consumption. We also see a decrease in reliance on imports. This additional decrease compared to the first scenario that we saw is attributed to limiting imports of some crops to 100% self-sufficiency, which are also no longer exported according to this scenario. This analysis also shows a 4% decrease in cost. This decrease is coming from replacing imported pulses by locally produced ones and due to reduced import overall. Next. In this scenario, so the key differences here between the B1 scenario that I just shared and this scenario is the currency conversions rate. So as we heard earlier in the presentation by Dr. Yani, we did this research at a time where the currency was undergoing devaluation, and in fact in the past 2 years. So the conversion rate that we're looking at here is $1 for 4,000 Lebanese pounds. We are closer to 40,000 Lebanese pounds in less than 2 years. So which really makes it more urgent and more important that we look at identifying ways to improve our food security and ensuring that we have a locally produced basket that ensures that food security that does not rely as much on importing, and given the high fluctuation of currency conversions rate. So again, the key difference between this scenario and the other is the currency conversions rate, and we're exploring the 4,000 per dollar, 4,000 Lebanese pounds per dollar. So it's no surprise here that with a more than 2.5-fold increase for this conversions rate, that we have an overall cost increase relative to 2017. So to do this assessment, import costs and export revenues were calculated according to the new rate. And given that many of the primary resources used on farm are imported, so again, we're not looking at local production as it being just costing us in the local currency, because a lot of the primary resources are in fact imported, and that has implications on the cost of local production even, which is affected by that currency devaluation. So it was assumed that the increase in local production costs will be equal to 50% of the increase in the rate between 2017 and the new rate. And given the uncertainty of future currency conversions rate, again, it becomes more critical for us to identify a strategic food basket that could be produced locally in order to reduce that reliance on foreign markets. Moving to the fourth scenario, scenario C, explores the potential of diversifying water and energy portfolios as it builds on the main components of the first scenario that I highlighted at the beginning, which includes increasing the production of beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas to 100% self-sufficiency. This scenario includes shifting from using diesel as the main energy source for pumping water on farms to solar energy. So we see here that it's 50-50 for this scenario between diesel and solar. We also see in this scenario that we're also exploring the impact of using treated wastewater as part of the irrigation portfolio as well, with 20% of treated water and 20 from groundwater, or 60 from groundwater and 20 from surface water. So similar to the first scenario that we saw, this scenario requires additional water, land, and provides additional nutrition and reduced reliance through shifting to low energy intensive water sources, including surface water and treated wastewater. And in this scenario, scenario shows around 13% energy savings. So moving away from high energy intensive groundwater pumping and diversifying that. Also shifting toward a greater use of solar energy for water pumping, 55% of the emissions are reduced. So due to the new currency convergence rate, we again see major increase of 94% of the net cost for producing this basket. So some of the main trade-offs we see here as part of this scenario is that the energy requirements, carbon emissions, and cost of the local production of this food basket could be reduced, has the potential to be reduced by shifting to less energy intensive water sources for irrigation and using renewable energy. And that makes local production more competitive compared to import. Now, I need to mention here also that this assessment does not necessarily currently include the initial investment cost for adopting these new water and energy portfolio options. So we're looking to do that in future development of this framework as we expand that cost function of the tool to include initial investment costs as part of the analysis. Moving to our last scenario, this scenario builds on the last scenario that I just shared. So again, we have the increase in beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas to 100% self-sufficiency. We're decreasing the production of crops with more than 100% self-sufficiency to 100% with no additional export and no additional import of these food products. Water is coming from groundwater, surface water, and treated wastewater, as well as energy for water coming from diesel and solar. So this scenario builds on the scenario that I just shared, which limits export while diversifying water and energy portfolios under currency convergence change. So similar to the trends we saw earlier, this scenario shows greater energy savings and energy and emission reduction, as well as water preservation by supplementing irrigation water for treated wastewater. So again, with looking at this scenario and under the currency fluctuation, we see the key message lies in the potential of mitigating some of these negative trade-offs and improving resource savings by exploring new water and new energy options for agriculture in an effort to make local production more competitive. Moving to the next slide. So in addition to the quantification that we did using the tool and following the framework that we have developed, we have conducted a survey with 200 farmers in the Bekaa Valley, and we were really curious about the willingness and openness of farmers to adopt these different practices that we're talking about. We do realize that water, energy, and food systems do not exist in a vacuum, and different actors, whether we're talking about consumers, producers, regulators, all have different preferences and goals that need to be accounted for and evaluated as part of this assessment that we're doing. So as part of this project, we particularly focused on the farmers, and we asked them a twofold question. The first part of the question was, given the possibility of you being able to use alternative energy sources on your farm, or growing different crops, or using alternative irrigation sources, water sources for irrigating your crops, how would you rank these three options? The second part of the question was, given that you go with that option, what would incentivize you, or what would be your motive to make that shift or adopt that practice? And given the responses we got from the 200 surveyed farmers in the Bekaa Valley, farmers said that they are most open and willing to use alternative energy sources on their farm. So that ranked as number one. Number two was they were open to growing different crops on their farm. And the third was using alternative irrigation sources. And it was not a surprise that the number one motivation for each of these practices was to improve profit. So that came as number one motivator. So farmers perceived that shifting to each of these as they rank them as a potential for them to improve profit. As we see in the looking at alternative energy sources, it's improving profit, then saving water, then reducing emissions. For growing crops, they are incentivized to do that, again, to improve profit, followed by saving energy, followed by saving land and water, reducing emissions, and last, improving the nutritional value. And third, when it comes to using alternative irrigation sources, again, they're interested primarily in improving their profit, saving energy, saving underground water, and then reducing emissions. So we wanted to use the scenarios that we developed, the different hypothetical scenarios that we developed, and try to weigh those scenarios with some of these preferences that we learned from the survey by the farmers. And if we can go to the next slide, please. We basically developed this sustainability index, which looks at the weights that we got from farmers for their preference of minimizing and maximizing the different outputs that we're quantifying for each of these different scenarios. So a most favorable scenario would be one that minimizes cost, energy, land, water emissions, and maximizes nutrition, which is reflected by the sustainability index equation you see here. And those different metrics or outputs are weighed by the preferences and the ranking that was provided by the farmers. Again, we acknowledge that different stakeholder groups, different sectors might have different preferences for minimizing and maximizing these outputs. So further investigation of that needs to be done in order to use those analytics to drive that dialogue that needs to happen across different sectors. But given the scenarios that I just shared, for example, and following this or incorporating the preferences for farmers, we can see that scenario one scored more poorly than scenario B1 based on this sustainability index that we have developed, meaning that farmers are favoring reallocating some of the crops that are currently being produced for export for more of the local production. But again, this is just an example, a hypothetical example at this point, and we intend to explore this further again with a wider group of stakeholders to for this to be more representative of the kind of analysis that we'd like to do. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Muhtar. You're muted.
Thank you so much, Basil. Thank you for all the audience who joined us this morning, this afternoon. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Kuoshima from FAO, who has been a partner in this work and is the co-author of the report that's been published by FAO. Again, to wrap up the project, I'd like to highlight some of the outcome and the policy implication. Some of this has been highlighted earlier by Sandra and Basil. Yes, we have a nutrition focus in this project, and we wanted to make sure that the starting point is the diet, a Mediterranean diet for a Lebanese population. So investing in broad bean, lentil, chickpea, and peas, which are rich in protein, will result in cost saving and increase in nutritional value, which is expected in the locally produced basket, and reduce the reliance on foreign market. This is very important today, as been highlighted earlier by Sandra and Basil, that Lebanon, in fact, since we've done this study, the currency has continued to devaluate. When we, at the conception phase, $1 was equivalent to 1,500 Lebanese lira. Today, it's approaching 40,000 for $1. So you could see the devaluation as we speak. In fact, some of the results that we highlighted and we presented was presented by Basil will certainly look different today if we look at the current currency rates. So certainly it makes sense to invest in the high nutritional value. The crops that has high nutritional value, it makes sense. However, this comes at the cost, as highlighted in the scenarios that Basil mentioned, comes at the cost of water, energy, land, and carbon footprint. So there's a trade-off that existed there. However, it becomes more critical today to use such a tool to identify strategies to at least come close to achieving the food basket in Lebanon and produce locally and reduce the reliance on foreign market. This is more relevant today than any point in the past. Sorry. Next. Continuing in project outcome and policy implication, the framework scenario analysis developed in this study shows that within the scope that we investigated the food basket, we didn't do everything, but we had a certain food basket that we analyzed, that Lebanon has the potential to be more food and nutrition secure. And we have three different levers that I'd like to discuss. Number one is to reallocate within the existing resource pie. The reallocation is to moving cropping system, increasing the arable land, but the reallocation in terms of what do a cropping system look like for an optimum scenario that could evolve as a result of the crisis that Lebanon is moving. So number one is a reallocation of cropping system. Second, expanding the existing resource pie. And this is when we look into new energy sources, this is when we look at new water sources, renewable sources that will allow the Lebanese farmer additional energy and water and land for expanding their resource pie. The third is a policy implication, which is creating the environment that provides the necessary incentive for following the reallocation and expansion of the resource pie. So the government has a role to play here. There's a lot of incentive that the government can do. And I'm not going to get into those because some of those may be controversial, including subsidies on certain crops and including also on not flooding the market with certain crops that Lebanese farmers are producing. But this is a discussion that we can maybe have later. But there is a lot of policy implication that the government could do. Last but not least, in the policy implication and project outcome, is that we did not take into account in the framework that we developed a spatial temporal distribution in terms of the suitability of soil map, in terms of the variability in making these trade-off decisions. So this a social spatial temporal map is certainly needed moving forward. This allows the development of the framework to be scalable and be applied at a regional scale, which is our aim since the conception of the project is to take this case study in the Bekaa Valley as introduced earlier by Rami and scale this up regionally. And that this is, we're still hoping that we could do that in partnership with our partner FAO, and other regional players. Again, this is a tool that can be used for a dialogue, cross-sectoral dialogue. As highlighted earlier in the analysis, there are trade-offs, and with trade-offs, there are losers and winners. So how do you develop this tool as a catalyst for these cross-sectoral dialogue and allow for a pathward forward for development of these strategies that some may like, some may not like. However, collectively, as a society, maybe this is something that needs to be done. Next is the information informing policymakers. There are, as I mentioned earlier, there are policy implications that this tool or framework can play a role informing policymaker and planning in Lebanon as the country works or implementing UN Sustainable Development Goals. And again, the UN Sustainable Development Goals is the ultimate nexus, and implementing strategies for the UN SDGs require a platform such as the one that we described, but maybe with a wider lens. Last but not least, as I mentioned earlier, we are hoping that this case study can be adopted and replicated in other countries in the MENA and other dry regions of the world. I think this is the last slide. I'd like to stop here. Thank everybody for taking the time to attend, and back to you, Rami.
Thank you very much, Javier. What a wonderful piece of work. Extremely impressive, still, relevant and gaining in relevance in spite of all that has been going on in Lebanon. And I do endorse the effort and the plan to expand this study and to look at the findings in light of the tremendous change that has happened since 2017 till now. But once a model is developed, this becomes also a matter of including new data and crunching it through. And I think this is something that you probably have on your agenda. I'm going to move to some of the questions of the audience. I have a question from Sabrina. The questions are all in the chat, and they would please ask you to use the chat for the question. And Sabrina Ulmasova is asking, thank you. She's thanking the panel for the valuable insights and asking, is the scenarios analyzed among the imported? Has it been fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides? In that case, has the scenario of organic farming ever been considered to look at to assess the potential costs and benefit of the given crops? Would anyone like to address this question? Bassel?
Thank you for the question, Sabrina. And yes, we did. And in fact, not only the cost of importing fertilizers for our scenario, but also the energy footprint and associated carbon footprint was also accounted for as part of the analysis that we did. Have we done a scenario for organic farming? We haven't done that. I think this would be an excellent exercise to do, to look at the costs and benefits, especially when it comes to nutrition outcomes, as well as the other side also of looking at the implications it would have on land footprint and reliance outputs. I think this would definitely be an interesting scenario to explore.
May I follow up on Sabrina's question?
So Sabrina is saying the cost of input will decrease, and I think you have addressed this in your answer. I think this was written as you were talking. Let me move to another question.
May I follow up on Sabrina's very important question, and maybe she knows the answer. I certainly don't. Are the consumers and how much are they and how much willing to pay additional for organic? I think this is a key question that maybe can guide the future scenarios, is that how much are you willing to pay additional for organic. I think your question is extremely important, and for Lebanese farmers, they need to create a niche moving forward, and this could be one of those. So the question remains is how much we're willing to pay for an additional organic to substitute for maybe lower yield in certain cases. But thank you, very important question.
So the questions from Darren Drollinger, and where the farmer is selected as a mixture of traditional progressive farmers, what is the average age of the farmers? A question about the farmers here from Darren.
I believe they were a mixture, like the Lebanese farmers, or especially in the Beqa, they are not really categorized, so you cannot really go to them as different groups. But they were selected from the general farmer population in the Beqa. And if I'm going to guess, I cannot remember off the top of my head the average age, but I think it would be middle-aged. There was a combination of younger and some who are really interested in adopting new technologies, and some who were, like sticking to their own old ways. But it was a broad range of farmers.
If I may add also, I mean, in terms of the farms, the average size of the farm, and Sandra might have mentioned that earlier, was less than 6 hectares. So we're talking about smallholder farms here. So
Thank you,
nothing. Yeah.
This answers a question that was just posed at the end of the current thing. And then there is a key question by Wasim Bahr, very important question about the relative income that is produced from growing lentil pulses versus the export crops. And I presume this has been accounted for under your cost, the cost part of your scenario. Could you please clarify this?
Yeah, I volunteer a response to Wasim's question, which is extremely important, as Rami mentioned. The platform has a 2 pathway forward. In fact, early on when we were developing the scenarios, we were struggling with this question, whether the scenarios are for food security or whether they are for productivity and income. And these are 2 different pathways. We chose to go the route of food security. In the question we asked, if Lebanon population is X, and this is the diet, how do you secure and to what extent you can secure domestic production? That was a different question than the important question Wasim is answering. The bottom line is the tool or the platform allows you to do either, allows you to have a profit being the main criteria, or allows you to develop scenarios based on food security. But these are strategic questions that the Lebanese government, the Lebanese government should be asking. Is the production, local production for maximizing profit at the farm level that trickles down to the economy, or is it for national food security? Those are extremely important questions, but the tool allow you to do that, Wasim. However, we can explore that further in scenario building. Thank you.
Sure. I just make perhaps a parenthesis here, just to say that this is about one of the pillars of national food security, right? The local production pillar, because there are other drivers of food security, the ability, the economic access to food and whatever its source is, the way it is cooked, and so on and so forth, so that our students of food security keep remembering that food security is not only agricultural production, but it is also the other pillars of food security. But this particular part is important, as you mentioned, Rabia. I have, the question, I'm going to, yes.
May I answer this?
Sure.
2 things. First thing is just showing the beauty of a tool like this. When you have a tool that has already defined all these linkages, then you can expand. You can look at different scenarios. And noting that there are things that were not included in this tool. So for example, meat production or fish production or other things that can be, to broaden the scale and to look at the whole agricultural situation. And another thing is when you're going, for example, for legumes or something like a high protein, plant-based protein, and if this is a policy that the government wants to go, for example, then you can look at the industry side of things. And there are a lot of other products that can be developed using these plant-based proteins, not just for direct consumption, but for industry, for maybe production of new, like, I don't know, chickpea flour or something like that, which has a market globally. So it's more not just like looking at these specific numbers, but looking at how this can fit into the broader scene in the agricultural sector as a whole.
Indeed, absolutely. I think the outcome, the most important outcome of this research is the tool itself, rather than the finding, which are a case study that evolves with time. Thank you, Sandra, for bringing that up very, very clearly. The focusing too much on the output of the exercise, it makes us look at, and forget a little bit about the importance of the tool and its flexibility and its ability to be adapted. The true outcome of the project is the tool itself. Thank you, Rabia, and thank you, Sandra, for making this very clear. Let me move to Farah Kamaluddin's question. The implications of the suggested scenarios on food security. Farah, I think this has been it's been addressed in the discussion that has preceded this issue. We've just been talking about it, and I'll move to Adel Ghandour's question. So Adel is asking whether the farmers are willing to remove their orchards for seasonal production, and whether I'm not even sure this was asked by farmers or this was even on the agenda, and whether the incentive mentioned as substitution of the crop was the profit is aspect. I didn't understand that. Is aspect is granted for the farmer? That's not very clear to me. And in my opinion, it's very difficult to convince farmers to change their cultivation practices besides the agricultural practices. So let's first address the core of this question is, what is the willingness of farmers to adopt and change their practices and adopt the practices that are being recommended or suggested by this exercise? Sandra, I'm seeing you, nodding along, so I'm assuming that you have an answer or something to say about that.
Yeah, well, I also think Basil has something to say, but just to add that we did not specifically, we're not recommending anything, we're just looking at scenarios. And of course, I don't believe that farmers will be willing to take out their orchards or their trees. Those are valued in the culture. But there are other ways to do intercropping, maybe. Like you can grow crops on a local small scale between trees if needed. But that specific question was not addressed with the farmers.
Okay.
Basil,
do you want to add something here?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say that yes, this was not specifically asked as part of the survey, but according to the results that we got in terms of the prioritization, I mean, it was clear to us that farmers were certainly more open to adopt renewable energy on their farm far more than switching to another crop. So yeah, that definitely didn't surface as the first thing that farmers are willing to switch towards. So but yeah, I mean, further investigation of that is worth doing, and as we expand the study further.
Okay. Okay. And your second question, Adel, I think we've addressed it. I just addressed it in my comments. So I'm also going to skip that one. And a question by Sabrina again: how can this tool be accessed for us researchers? Is it a public access tool? Is it, so more info here will be welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Sabrina. I would not call it a tool. I would call it a platform, a framework, because the discussions ongoing with our partners with FAO to take this platform, scale it up to other locations, as I see Darren's comment also here to have, there are plans. We're hoping that this would become a tool that can be scaled up, be available. We had some discussions with FAO about making that possible. But at the moment, it's not a tool, standalone tool. It's basically a framework platform that we use to test the ground for the system of systems interactions and for guiding policy making. I do hope that funding becomes available, so this becomes available as a standalone tool, scalable and regional for any other locations beside the case study presented.
Okay, thank you. And then Adel again okay. Adel is my student. بدك تركز لي شوية على الجرامر يا عادل. Is the government, okay, can the government impose the production of these specific varieties?
It can incentivize, not necessarily impose, but could play a role in incentivizing certain practices.
Okay. So I think, though, you know, Adel asks a very pertinent question, and I think it's worth digging a little bit more into that because so I haven't. I mean, our hosts and our guests are not being introduced, but I can introduce Adel. He works, you know, as a person who's been working in the field with farmers for the best part of 20 years, and his judgment is very trustworthy on this. And the questions that he's posing are actually beyond what a theoretical approach, you know, can deliver. And so we're talking here about suggesting policy making. But can we imagine a situation in which there is a policy that can actually impose the production of a certain crop to replace another? And is this even the purpose of this platform? Can you answer this question, please?
I mean, Rami, I'd like to, there was a question earlier that was posed by Wasim, which is, in my mind, is similar. At least categorically. What I responded to Wasim is that there are two basic questions that we need to address, which is, do we produce to secure food for our population, or do we produce for profitability and income? And who's there to decide on these two pathways? In the US, nobody. I mean, people produce whatever they want. There is a abundance, and economy seems to be a dominant. What if you're living in a shortages of resources, whether water, whether land, whether others, and to what extent can the government impose or incentivize, as Basil would like to state it, certain directions for high nutritional food or for cropping system that would serve the people? I think that's a very strategic question, and it has not been brought up yet to light. Maybe Rami would be the ideal person to address that.
Yes, well, you know, in a free economy, which is the case of Lebanon, I mean, it's like ultra free economy. This appears to me to be extremely difficult. And your survey of farmers has actually shown that the driving force is profit. And this is, of course, because this is a sector that is totally and completely free, in which there is minimum or extremely light governmental inference or interference. I mean, you probably know that the budget of the Ministry of Agriculture is less than 1% of the total government budget. This is when we have a budget. So you know, with this in this relation. I mean, this is not going to be very possible. In addition to that, you are not without knowing that there is myriad NGOs working in development in the region here in the country, and that they promote an export-based production. For example, a lot of the international money that is poured inside the rural area promotes the production of crops for export, avocado, sometimes citrus, other crops such, like this. So this is, something that would make this difficult. However, let me just say the proviso, everybody's looking at the creation of a new Lebanon on the, rising again, and strategies and policies such as this one must absolutely accompany a new vision for the country. So hence the importance of this platform as a policy guidance tool. That's what I have to say about that.
Dr. There's one more thing. Sometimes it doesn't take the government, to lead into a different way of production. It might be that we're going into a situation where we don't have enough water anymore, simply to keep going, to keep producing what we produce. So we need to shift, The question is, how best should we shift to make use of the water that we have available now?
Sure, and you're right, Sandra.
One of the questions for me.
But what is driving the shift in this study, what's important is nutrition security is what is driving this study.
Yes.
Pulses to the way. And in a farmer's mind, what will drive the shift towards less water consumption is going to be profit. So until that time where nutrition security and profits curves meet, you're still going to be talking about two different things. One as people who are public servants, like, or who want to serve society and bring new ideas, and another people who you cannot, you cannot criticize for wanting to survive. So this is
so building on this, can we imagine a scenario where, building on the idea of wanting to put nutrition security at the center and localizing that as much as possible, can we imagine a scenario where we have subsidies for producing specific strategic crops that would ensure a certain portion of the nutrition needs that we need locally? And then, given the limitation that you're talking about in terms of budget for the agricultural sector, I mean, maybe the question becomes, how do we innovate, create different financial streams, innovative models that would allow us to create such subsidies to incentivize farmers to produce these crops and meet that overall goal at the national level?
And I think here Sabrina says something about it. So she says subsidies is the first thing that comes to mind, and I think Rabia was alluding to that when he said this is something that's political and as an incentive, but where do the subsidies come from if the government isn't motivated in Lebanon? And then she says we should motivate the Eat Lancet study, of course, shows this very, very clearly. And I wish health was part of the platform. I think that health, it needs to be an important part of this, not only the health of the environment, but also the health of humans. And the offset of the charges and of the pressure on the health sector can more than cover any subsidies that are offered to farmers in order to do that. Okay, so that is something that we frequently discuss in the classes that we give in food security in EB, and I believe that the next platform should absolutely look at the offset of the of the diet that is promoted on this, and happy to guide you on that.
One thing I'd like to add to this very rich discussion is that we have heard from farmers. We've taken this to the farmers. We've heard from them. Certainly, we've deliberated this at the science. But the third the third pillar of the stool that's missing is feedback from the policymakers who are, we're assuming that this is something that they want to use for better decision making. One of our plans that was disrupted by Corona was to hold a third webinar involving policymakers. And we have actually a series of set of publications that will come out. We have the report from FAO, we have 2 policy briefs, and the publication that I put on the chat that will be coming out soon. But the discussions, dialogue with the policymakers has not happened. And I would go back to Rami's point that it should happen today. Because I don't think they are aware of these implications. I don't think they're aware of the role of the agriculture sector in these 2 conflicting areas that we've been talking about: economy and being an agro-based economy, and food security for the people. And I think this discussion ought to happen. And I think I can't figure out any better institution but AUB and the Food Security Program to lead that discussion nationally. And we'll all will be part of that. But I think it's a critical discussion that needs to happen with the policymakers.
Well, thank you, Rabia. We're treading on the path that you have opened, but you'll be also happy to know that the Parliamentary Committee on SDGs that is chaired and convened by MPNI as the dean, whom you know, is actually very invested into this and it's been discussing. And in fact, there is a bit of reticence on behalf of agriculture because the problem with entrusting food security to the agriculture sector is that very often it cannot see beyond the food production. And that in itself is an issue that we're dealing with and addressing through the UN system. But the SDG give you a really good ground. And one of the campaigning points is that agriculture should not only be an economic project, but also a social project and a health project. So you have, agriculture farming rests on 3 important pillars: an economic pillar indeed, but also a social pillar that's associated with rurality, rural life and rural culture and rural environment and rural landscapes. And indeed also it interacts very strongly with a health pillar, because in order to shift from one production to the other, and from your position here that while we consume a lot of fruits and vegetables in Lebanon, the problem is, and I'm going into deep waters here, the problem is the quantity of pesticide residues that can be, I'm not saying they're always there, but that can be in it, and that form an invisible agent of illnesses completely separate from the one that is created by the overconsumption of certain types of food, leading to lifestyle illnesses. And that in itself is something that farmers are aware of, but that they go towards in order to reduce costs, because farmers in Lebanon, as we were saying a little while ago, are completely left to fend and to fight their own way in a world system that is filled with subsidized foods originating from everywhere in the world, from the Arab world and from Europe and from the Americas. We're one of the very few countries that does not subsidize its farmers. I'm sure you know that, right? And we ask them to compete with subsidized produce coming from outside. And the way they do that is by, choosing below standards agrochemicals, which then contribute to a decline in the health. And these are issues that need to be addressed. The subsidies that we're talking about are not really subsidies. They're an offset, a small offset of the costs of health care. That is important.
Wonderful discussion.
Well, I'm seeing another message, and so that's Sabrina, and I think your words are words of wisdom, Sabrina. The future of farming in its multifunctionality and exploration of its valuable ecosystem services that can bring a multitude of economic profits. And I think these are extremely important terms, and I'm ready to wrap up this great discussion on these words of wisdom. I just have one question to ask to the organizer. One of the attendants has asked me if there will be a certificate of any sort for the people who have attended this meeting. And my answer was that I don't think so, but I will ask, and here am I asking.
I will, we haven't thought about it, but if ASABE is willing to help us with that, we certainly can do it. But Darren is heading, yes? So.
Yeah, we'll work with you, Rabia. We absolutely can provide that, and I think we know all that we're on. So sure.
So
okay,
if anybody is wanting to have that certificate, let them drop us a note. I'll put my email in the chat, so we can certainly do that.
All right. So while Dean Mukhtar is writing his email in the chat box, I would also encourage all the AUBites who are attending to actually send for a request for those certificates. They're important. You have attended, you have participated, and I think it is only fair that this is recognized as you're building your CVs and your courses for the future. And on this, I think we are ready to come to the end of this session. I think this was literally one of the best sessions I have attended online or in person this year. And I'm not saying this because I moderated it, although that's part of it. But I want to just make sure that everybody recognizes this. This has been a fantastic, collaborative, cooperative, free exchange of ideas on the basis of an excellent piece of research. So thank you very much, first for the attendees, and second for the panelists and the researchers and the presenters. Thank you very much. A big hand to everyone.
Thank you all.
Here.
Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and hope we'll meet you again in different webinars.
I'd like also to thank ASABE for hosting us. So
ASABE, thank you very much for that. Apologies, Darren.
No worries. Great job. Excellent job, all. Very well done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darren. Hope we'll meet again. We'll meet someday. Bye-bye.
Look forward to it.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Goodbye. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.